They say prison hardens men. They say the justice system is blind. But what happens when that system turns its eyes toward a child? At 6 years old, most kids are still learning to tie their shoes. They're still mixing dreams with reality, still believe monsters live under the bed, not inside courtrooms. But in one real-life inspired case, buried under decades of sealed records and quiet apologies, a child stood in front of authority figures who decided his life was already over. There were no handcuffs big enough, no prison uniform small enough. Yet the machinery of punishment rolled forward anyway. This is not a story about a monster. It's a story about how monsters are made, by fear, by pressure, by institutions that refuse to admit they're wrong. And by the time the truth finally surfaced, it was far, far too late. Before we dive into this chilling story, drop a comment and let us know where you're re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you appreciate deep dives into true crime like this, please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin. The town didn't look dangerous. It was just another working-class place where everyone knew your name, and everyone knew your business. Factories lined the outskirts, and church bells marked time better than clocks. Police officers were your family friends, until they weren't. When a brutal crime shattered the community's calm, the town didn't just ask who did it. It asked, how fast can we make this fear stop? And fear has a way of demanding a sacrifice. The investigation moved fast. Way too fast. Officers needed answers before rumors turned into riots. Parents wanted reassurance that their children were safe. The local paper wanted headlines printed by morning. And then, someone noticed the child. He lived close enough. He looked different enough. He was quiet, poor, and completely unprotected. He was 6 years old. There is no recording of the interrogation that followed. No lawyer was present. No parent was in the room. All we have is a transcript, typed up later, written by the very people who insisted the child understood everything. But developmental experts all agree on one thing. A 6-year-old cannot comprehend criminal responsibility the way an adult can. Their minds simply aren't built for it. Yet, the questions came anyway. They told him stories. They corrected his answers. They promised he could go home, back to his life, if he just told the truth. Hours crawled by. By the end, the words no longer sounded like his own. What was written down became a confession. What became a confession became evidence. And that evidence became his destiny. Once a narrative forms inside the justice system, it doesn't bend easily. It's like a river carving through stone. It finds its path and rarely changes course. Contradictions in the case were dismissed as simple confusion. Physical evidence that didn't match the story was labeled inconclusive. Expert opinions were never even requested, because no one wanted to hear what they might say. The case moved forward, not with a public trial or a jury of his peers, but with decisions made behind closed doors. The word sentence was used. Not in public, not loudly, but it was there, whispered in hallways and documented in sealed files. The system had made its choice. There are prisons with nurseries for inmate mothers. There are prisons with dedicated mental health wings and education blocks. This was none of those. It was a transfer facility, cold, concrete, and echoing with the sounds of metal doors and adult voices. Officially, the records didn't call it a prison placement. They called it protective containment. But the cold walls didn't know the difference, and neither did the guards. They tried to make it work. They cut down adult uniforms. They shortened schedules. They made exceptions where they could. But at night, when the lights went out, the screams that echoed through the halls were all the same. The child learned to survive, and he learned it quickly. Silence kept you safe. Eye contact was dangerous. Crying was a sign of weakness that you couldn't afford to show. He memorized the sound of footsteps. He learned which guards ignored him, and which ones watched a little too closely. The other inmates started calling him Ghost. Because he moved so quietly. Because he was trying with all his might not to exist. This wasn't rehabilitation. This was erasure. And the people in charge? They weren't paying attention anymore. The paperwork was filed. The story had settled into fact. Justice, they said, had been served. The case was closed. Years passed. New officers rotated in, and the old ones retired, taking their memories with them. The file on the 6-year-old boy gathered dust in a forgotten cabinet. And the child grew, not normally, not safely, but inevitably. As he grew, Social workers began to raise concerns. Psychologists wrote reports detailing the severe trauma he was enduring. But most of their warnings were ignored. Because reopening this case meant admitting something truly unthinkable, that the system had condemned a child to a life sentence without ever saying the words out loud. It meant confronting a mistake so profound, it was easier for everyone to just look away. The lie had become comfortable. By the time he was an adolescent, the damage was permanent. The prison hadn't just held his body, it had rewired his brain. He suffered from severe nightmares, disassociation, and explosive fear responses. He wasn't born dangerous, but the environment he was forced to grow up in was shaping him into someone the world would eventually fear, which, in a cruel twist of irony, made his potential release seem impossible. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, written and directed by the very system that claimed to be protecting society. The first cracks in this decades-old story didn't come from the courts. They came from a journalist. An old tip, a forgotten source, a nagging question that wouldn't go away. One question led to another. One sealed document finally got unsealed, and one contradiction became too glaring to ignore. Suddenly, the official narrative began to fall apart. Witness statements from back then didn't line up. Timelines collapsed under scrutiny. And the confession? It read exactly like it was written by adults speaking through a child, using words and concepts a 6-year-old could never have known. For the very first time, the story wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about responsibility. The responsibility of a system that had failed so catastrophically. As a journalist started digging into the case of a man in prison since childhood, the system began to close ranks. Officials refused interviews. Key records went missing. Inmates were transferred in the dead of night. The prison became a ghost, an institution that was never denied, but never fully acknowledged either. Because if the public truly saw what was happening behind those walls, someone would have to answer for it. The journalist didn't expect such fierce resistance, at least not at first. Initial requests for information were simply delayed. Then, they were flat out denied. Finally, they were met with an unnerving, deafening silence. But paper trails have a way of speaking when people refuse to. A tired, underpaid clerk, her conscience weighing on her, noticed something strange. Pages were missing from the original intake record. Dates on different documents didn't align. The signatures looked too perfect, almost like they were copied. The deeper the journalist dug into the paperwork, the clearer the horrifying truth became. This case wasn't just rushed. It was engineered. The system hadn't stumbled into a catastrophic mistake. It had walked into it, deliberately. When the article finally dropped, it wasn't a bombshell. It was a whisper that echoed across the nation. There were no bold accusations, no sensational claims. Just a single, haunting question printed in plain text. How did a 6-year-old end up here? The silence that followed was louder and more profound than any public outrage. Suddenly, the phone started ringing. Former guards, retired police officers, a social worker who, years earlier, had tried to raise an alarm only to be told to stand down. Each person held a single piece of a sprawling, dark puzzle. But until that article, no one had ever seen the whole picture. Inside the prison, the very air seemed to change. Word travels fast behind concrete and steel. The man, once known only as a ghost in the system, heard the whispers first. Guards were tense, their usual routines replaced with nervous energy. Schedules were suddenly altered. All visits were now monitored with extreme scrutiny. For the first time in his entire life, people were asking questions about him, not just talking around him. But hope is a dangerous thing in prison. It's a foreign currency, especially when it's brand new. He had learned long ago not to trust it. Decades later, therapists brought in to evaluate him made a chilling discovery. He didn't remember his childhood in years, months, or seasons. He remembered it in rooms. The cold interrogation room. The small, claustrophobic holding room. The cell that was promised as temporary but became his whole world. His mind had frozen time right where the trauma was most acute. When they asked him about the crime itself, he couldn't recall the act. He only recalled being told, over and over, to agree with what they were saying. Legal experts began to examine the original confession transcript, and what they found was devastating. The language patterns didn't match a child's speech. The entire sequence of the confession mirrored the suggestive phrasing of the adults in the room. Key details of the crime only appeared after direct prompting from the interrogators. In legal terms, the confession wasn't just unreliable. It was impossible. But impossible things happen all the time when no one is watching. As the case gained national attention, the town where it all began had to face an uncomfortable truth. Most people had moved on. New generations had been born, and new tragedies had taken the spotlight. But reopening this case meant reopening something far worse than an old wound: collective guilt. Because teachers had noticed the boy was troubled. Neighbors had suspected something was wrong. Even some of the officers involved had their doubts. But certainty was so much easier than conscience. And fear of rocking the boat, fear of being wrong, kept everyone quiet. There's an unwritten rule in prisons, a code that keeps the entire system functioning. Don't rock the story that keeps the doors locked. Guards who had previously pushed for a review of the case found themselves reassigned to remote posts. Psychologists' notes were subtly rewritten to sound softer, less alarming. Critical incident reports vanished into a bureaucratic backlog, never to be seen again. The system understood a terrifying truth. Once the public realizes the bars on one cell shouldn't be there, every other case becomes suspect, too. Then, without any warning, he was moved. A different facility, hundreds of miles away. A different name on the roster. The same crushing reality inside. Officially, the transfer was for his well-being and safety. Unofficially, it was about creating distance. Distance from the prying eyes of journalists. Distance from the relentless investigators. And most importantly, distance from accountability. You can move a human body easily, but the truth is much heavier. It took months of legal battles to get him an interview. The state's lawyers debated liability. Prison administrators insisted on heavy supervision. But eventually, under immense public pressure, an interview was approved. No cameras were allowed inside the prison. No real-time audio recording. Just a transcript. The system was trying to control the narrative one last time. But this time was different. When the journalist asked him what he remembered most from the age of 6, he didn't mention the crime. He looked up and said, "I remember wanting to go home." Psychologists issued a stark warning. Even if he were released, it wouldn't fix him. Not because he was dangerous. He wasn't. But because his entire identity had been forged in captivity. Concepts like friendship, trust, and even simple human touch were all things he had learned under constant threat. Freedom, if it ever came, wouldn't feel free. It would just feel unfamiliar, another strange room he didn't understand. When the final petitions for his release reached the courts, the state's response was frustratingly predictable. They didn't argue his innocence directly. Instead, they argued about procedure. They raised issues of jurisdiction. They claimed the statute of limitations had passed. They were fighting about timing, not truth. Because justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes, it's justice buried under a mountain of paperwork, hoping everyone will simply forget. But we can't forget. Then came the unexpected. A box. Unlabeled, forgotten in a dusty storage room. Inside, original notes from the first responding officer. Notes that never made it into the official case file. These weren't just duplicates. They contained something new, something explosive. They named another suspect. An older man, someone close to the scene, who was mysteriously cleared without any explanation. It was like a path had been deliberately erased from the map of the investigation. But erasing isn't the same as destroying. The ink was still there. The prison reacted before the court even knew what was happening. Overnight, guards noticed new protocols being implemented. Supervisors started holding quiet, closed-door meetings. Legal teams, faces no one had ever seen before, began appearing in hallways they had no business walking down. An institution doesn't panic unless it knows something real is coming. And this was very, very real. The ripples were spreading, and the walls themselves seemed to be listening. But the hardest blow didn't come from the state, from the system he was fighting against. It came from a former advocate, someone who had once promised to see this through to the very end. They quietly withdrew their support. It wasn't because the case was weak, it was because the pressure was too strong. Unearthing this truth came with a cost. Some truths cost careers. Others, they cost lives. The silence from that corner was louder than any prison door slamming shut. By now, he had spent more of his life inside than he ever had outside. He didn't dream of revenge anymore. He didn't even dream of freedom. Most nights, he dreamed of nothing at all. Expecting something, anything, had always ended in the same brutal disappointment. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry in a place like this, so he had learned to travel light. But then, the story turned. Public pressure, fueled by small leaks and growing outrage, reached a breaking point. A special review panel was announced. The language was careful, the scope was narrow, and there were no promises. But it was more than he had ever had before. For the first time, the system wasn't just looking at the crime anymore. It was being forced to look directly at what it did to the child it had locked away. Behind closed doors, officials said what they would never admit in public. The whispers were clear. If this goes through, it changes everything. They weren't just talking about this one case. They were talking about every juvenile confession ever taken under duress. Every investigation rushed to a convenient close. Every institution that chose precedent over people. They weren't defending justice. They were defending their own history. Waiting becomes its own kind of sentence. The days turned into months. There were no updates, no answers. Just the same walls, the same echoing sounds, the same long nights. Hope, which he had worked so hard to bury, began to return. It felt slow, painful, like a half-healed scar reopening. Finally, the file reached the right hands. It landed on the desk of someone who hadn't been there at the beginning. Someone with no ties to the town, no loyalty to the official story. They looked at the evidence, at the erased suspect, at the child's confession, and reached a single, devastating conclusion. This conviction should never have existed. But that wasn't the end of the story, because undoing an injustice is always harder than creating one. And what came next would redefine what freedom actually costs. The ruling, when it came, didn't sound like a victory. It was quiet, cautious, and full of conditions. The panel didn't declare him innocent, not in those words. Instead, they declared the entire legal process fundamentally flawed. The sentence was vacated, but the state reserved the right to retry him. It was a technical freedom, not a moral one. After spending decades behind bars, the man who entered prison as a boy was told something chilling. You may leave, but only for now. The gate opened. There were no cameras allowed inside the frame, no cheering crowd, no celebration. There was just a man, standing still on the pavement, completely unsure of which direction to step. He had learned how to survive in cages. He knew the rules of a world made of concrete and steel. He didn't know about sidewalks, or traffic lights, or strangers who look at you without immediate threat in their eyes. Freedom didn't feel wide and open. It felt exposed. The world had moved on without him. He didn't recognize the sounds. The chime of phones in people's pockets, voices seeming to come from nowhere, doors that opened automatically. He saw a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, staring transfixed at a thin, glowing tablet. That child was older than he had been when his own life had stopped. No one ever teaches you how to grieve for lost time. And the prison never really let him go. Even on the outside, it followed him. There were mandatory check-ins, strict curfews, and psychological evaluations labeled transitional. He was free, but he was always being watched. It was as if the system still needed him to be something dangerous, just to justify what it had done to him all those years ago. Meanwhile, the threat of a retrial hung in the air. Behind the scenes, prosecutors debated their next move. Retrying the case was a huge risk. The new evidence could backfire spectacularly. But dropping the charges completely would be an admission of accountability, and that was something they were desperate to avoid. So they stalled. Evidence reviews dragged on for months. Key witnesses from back then suddenly couldn't be located. People's memories had conveniently faded. Once again, time itself was being used as a weapon against him. The nights were the worst. There were no bars on the windows, no locks on the door, yet he slept on the floor. His back was always against a wall, and he'd wake at the slightest sound, listening for footsteps that were never there. His therapists called it institutional trauma. He just called it home training. It was all he knew. A final forensic review of old juvenile cases, one that was never meant to be a big deal, ended up uncovering something chilling. A pattern. It wasn't just this one child. There were others, other minors, who had been questioned in the exact same way. When investigators looked at the transcripts, the same phrases popped up over and over. The same pressure tactics. The outcomes were different, of course, because most of those other kids weren't 6 years old. It was like the system had been practicing, refining its methods on slightly older, slightly more resilient children. And then, it found its easiest target. This one child, at 6 years old, paid the highest price for a system that had perfected its mistakes. As public pressure started to build around this case, officials finally released a statement. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of error. It was a defense. They said, the standards of the time were different. Different standards. But it was the same child. It was as if they were putting history itself on trial, arguing that responsibility has an expiration date, that what was wrong then is somehow okay now because time has passed. But for the person who lived through it, time doesn't change the facts. A different standard doesn't erase the damage. Through all the hours of tapes, all the pages of transcripts from the original investigation, one glaring omission stood out. No one, not a single detective, lawyer, or social worker, had ever leaned down and asked him a simple, fundamental question. Do you understand what's happening right now? It was a question so basic, it was almost invisible. Decades later, when a new investigator finally did ask him that, his answer was heartbreakingly honest. He said, I just thought they were mad at me. That was it. A 6-year-old's simple misunderstanding, a belief that he was just in trouble with the adults in the room, had cost him his entire life. Eventually, the prosecutors had to make a decision. But it didn't happen in a courtroom with cameras flashing. There was no grand public announcement. Instead, they quietly declined to retry the case. No official admission of guilt was ever issued. No apology was offered to the man whose childhood had been stolen. The conclusion was just a single line, buried deep within a stack of legal paperwork, insufficient evidence to proceed. It was a clinical, detached end to a human tragedy, a way to close the book without ever having to read the ugly chapters out loud. So, the charges were dropped. He was technically free. But what, really, was returned to him? Nothing. You can't get back a childhood. You can't rewind the clock on a missed education, on family holidays that never happened, on the simple memories of growing up that everyone else takes for granted. There was some talk of financial compensation, but that process was immediately delayed, then disputed. The system dragged its feet. Because money can't replace time, and everyone involved, especially the system itself, knew it. How do you put a price on a life that was paused at age 6? Sometime after his release, he went back to the building. The one that had held him for so long. He just stood there, looking at it from the outside. There was no anger on his face, no shouting at the walls. Just a profound, heavy silence. He understood something that day. Some prisons don't need iron bars or concrete walls to keep you locked up. The most effective ones are the ones that live inside you, the ones you carry with you long after you've walked out the gates. They become a part of the people who survive them. To this day, if you were to read the official files on this case, you'd find them to be very carefully worded. Words like mistake are nowhere to be found. The word failure is softened into something less direct. But there is one phrase that appears again and again: exceptional circumstances. It's a strange choice of words. It makes it sound like a 6-year-old being condemned was some kind of rare weather event, a freak occurrence of nature that couldn't be predicted or prevented. It completely removes the human element, the fact that this was the result of a series of decisions made by people in positions of power. And then came the final twist, the one that no one saw coming. Years after his release, a quiet, private inquiry finally reached its own conclusion. The original crime, the one he was accused of, had actually been solved years ago. The real perpetrator had died, never charged, never publicly named. The truth had been out there all along, tucked away in a different file cabinet. But for the institution, protecting its own credibility, avoiding the scandal of reopening such a deep and painful wound, was deemed more important than revealing the full truth. When he was finally told this, when he learned that they had known for years it wasn't him, his reaction wasn't what you'd expect. There was no explosion of rage. There were no tears of relief. He just sat there for a moment and then said one sentence: so it really wasn't me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an expression of relief. It was a confirmation. A quiet, devastating acknowledgement that for his entire life, a part of him had always carried the weight of that question, the possibility that maybe, somehow, he was what they said he was. The world now sees him as a symbol, a case study, a shocking headline. But for him, life is much simpler. It's divided into 2 parts, before 6 and after 6. There's nothing in between. The boy he was at 6 effectively ceased to exist that year, and the man he is today had to start over from that point. He is a living testament to a life that began and ended at the same time, a story forever frozen at that one pivotal age. Why does this one story matter so much? Because systems don't change when they're comfortable. They don't evolve when things are easy. They change when stories like this refuse to stay buried, when the truth claws its way to the surface. This wasn't something that happened in ancient history. This wasn't a fictional tale. This was the result of paperwork, of procedure, of silence. It was the story of a child who, from the moment he walked into that room, never stood a chance. There was no gavel slam to mark the end of his ordeal. There was no dramatic apology from a tearful official. The world didn't stop and collectively say, "We failed you." There was just a file, somewhere in a dusty office, quietly marked closed. That's because systems don't grieve the way people do. They don't lie awake at night, replaying bad decisions. They don't measure time in missed birthdays or erased childhoods. They measure it in procedures followed and risks avoided. That 6-year-old boy was never formally sentenced in a courtroom, but he served a life sentence anyway. Not because the evidence was strong, but because the system, in its fear and confusion, needed someone small enough to carry the blame. Today, that old prison building still stands. The town has moved on. The official records remain meticulously careful with their words. But somewhere, a man is walking freely for the very first time, learning to navigate a world that grew up without him. His story isn't about revenge. It isn't even really about justice, because how can you have justice for something that can never be undone? It's about what happens when we confuse closure with truth. It's about what happens when protecting our institutions becomes more important than protecting our children. Because the most dangerous sentence isn't the one handed down by a judge. It's the one we refuse to undo. And it can start as early as 6. Thanks for watching.